Yeah, React hooks. They came out, it's almost been a year, I think, when they were officially added to the language. They've been available for longer than that. You'd have to work with like a beta version of React that was in production, but what it's meant to do is make React even more declarative and more functional style. I mean, React is already super declarative with how we use it, but this makes it even more simple. And what it does away with is class components, basically. But React docs are very straightforward in saying class components are very much still part of the language. We're not getting rid of them. You should still use them. You shouldn't have to change your whole code base to now be using hooks. Keep what you have. They'll work great with what we have now. But you can use hooks in place of a class. Now, what are the two main reasons we need a class? Lifecycle methods, state. Okay, so we need the ability to use state or methods or lifecycle methods, but without the class, without an extension of the component. The first one we'll go over is called useState, and it is how you introduce state to a functional component. This also brings us to another interesting point. How many types of components do we have currently? 2. What's one of them? Stateless, also known as functional or display components, and then stateful, which are class components. Okay, so hooks, they made a third category for this because it is a functional component that has state and lifecycle methods if you want it. So to make a different differentiation, we have functional, we have class, and now we have function components, which look exactly like functional components. They're the same look, but they have the ability to reach into the functionality of a class component. So this is a functional component that uses hooks. So what we're going to do with this first example is we have a simple counter set up. I'm going to npm start.
Risky, you didn't even test it, have you?
No. I just full confidence it's going to work, I hope. How daft of you to just think it's going to work. Is it going to work? Nope. Cannot find app1.js, of course, because it's app. Okay. And it works. Minimal. All right, so simple functionality, but we're going to take away the class word and turn this into a functional component and make it work with the useState hook. So we'll const app equals a function. We'll get rid of state. We'll get rid of the methods. And now we have to make this work. And we'll get rid of the render. All right, so all hooks are imported the same way as the component is imported. It's a destructured import from React, so we can say give us useState from React. And all hooks start with this convention, the word use. You're going to use some sort of method functionality. So we need to introduce state to this. So this is how useState is used. You declare a constant, you open array brackets, and you say this equals useState, parentheses. So first, useState is a method that needs to take what your initial state should be. With React classes, what is the data type our state has to be? Object. With useState, it can be anything. So there's one advantage. So I'm going to start it off just as the number 0, not an object with like a dot count or something like that. What useState returns to me is an array with 2 items in it. And so using array destructuring, we can give a name to both those items. So really, we could just say, you know, data. And this is an array with an index 0 and an index 1. What index 0 is your state. So I'm going to call it count. So count will start off at 0. And the second thing it gives you is the set state for that one piece of state. So I'll call this set count as a convention to say this is the setter to change this piece of state. And that's all I have to do. I now have state and set state in this function. So if instead of this.state.count, what could we imagine this would be? Oh, we're using it here to get our state. What is our state called? Count. So we'll just display count. Okay, well now it doesn't know what increment is, right? I don't have the this keyword, and I don't have these methods anymore. But I have set count. But in order to give set count a new count, when I call it, what do I need to put before it? Anonymous function. Why do we need this again?
So that doesn't trigger.
Doesn't trigger immediately. And I can say set count to whatever count used to be plus 1. Then for decrement, I'll do the same thing. I'll say set count to count minus 1. And now we're back to our example with way less code, way less code. So pretty simple setup, really basics for useState. But any questions on this? The declaration looks a little strange, so anything we need to clarify on that? It is. It's so the setter methods work just like set state in the sense that they re-render. After set anything is called, a re-rendering occurs, and you have access to previous state if you need it. Now, what is previous state in this case? How would I access the count from previous state? So is previous state an object? What am I starting my state off as? A single number. So prev state is my count. There's no more dot unless I start this off as an object. So prev state is really prev count. It's just the previous number, and I can say prev count plus 1, prev count minus 1, and it'll work the same way. Now, if this was an object with a count that's equal to 0, then I'd have to say prev count dot count plus 1, prev count dot count minus 1, and this would be count dot count, because this object is what we're calling count, and it has a dot count. But that's redundant. Let's just do that.
If you're going to make it an object, it might be better just to call it first parameter or first argument state.
I would avoid calling it state because that's really general. That's the term class uses. I'd make it represent what it is. So if it was an object, let's say like our user, I'd call it that, or user state if you want to use the word state. And this would be, what would we call this? If our state is called user state, we'd want to set what? Set user state, just to keep that conventional. You can call it whatever you want, but calling it what it is makes it easier to get a grasp of. All right, and that is the very basics of useState. No more classes needed for state. Any other questions? Cool, well, if this is a good time then, let's talk about the rules of hooks. There's 2 of them. 2 main rules that you must live by, or everything will break. 1, hooks can only be used in functional components. You cannot use hooks in classes, won't work. 2nd, hooks can only be used at the top level of a functional component. What does that mean, top level? Before the return. So if I'm mapping out a bunch of components that need to use state, would I use useState in this return statement, or would I go do this in the component I'm mapping out? I'd do this in the component I'm mapping out. I don't want to declare or use hooks inside of a render or in a return statement. It has to be before this, and it can't be within another function. I can't have a function here called, make state that calls useState to make something. This is not the top level of the component. It's nested inside of an inner scope. We need it here. We need it outside. And those are the 2 rules. Other than that, they're pretty safe to use.
So I constantly make sure you see what your state is. You just constant log count.
So dev tools are trying to catch up to this because hooks are pretty new. It's not perfect yet. But if you go to React Dev Tools and you go to your component that has a state hook, it'll tell you you have hooks that created a state equal to 0. The bummer part about this, and until an update occurs, we won't be able to see it, is if you have an object with a count equal to 0, this is all it shows you. Objects of, oh yeah, we'll say count.count. So with objects, it won't let you see the inside. So you have to console log inside of right below this so you can see what happens every time it fires. And that's the downside. But there's another hook that's better for objects and arrays anyways. So if you're gonna use state, I'd typically stick to primitive data types, numbers, string, booleans. You can use objects for sure, but there's another hook that's better for it. Yeah. Yes, you can pass in a second. You can pass in a callback function if you want to memoize your data, which is a huge other thing that I unfortunately don't know well enough to teach you right now. But yes, this can take a callback function that memoizes your. Has anyone heard of memoizing? It sounds like a speech impediment. It's not. It's a word. Memoizing or memoization. And what it means is it's a function's ability to remember previous calls. So I have a function called sum that takes in two numbers and outputs a sum. First time I call it with 2 + 2, it has to compute that. But if it's in using memoization, it's going to cache that last time I called it with 2 + 2. And if I call it with those same parameters again, it won't have to redo the math. It's like, oh, you've already given me these two parameters. This was the output. Let's just give you that same output. And it can skip the whole computation. And so there's ways to do that with your state so that set states are even faster with new data being given to it. But there's another hook called useMemo that's specifically used for that. And we won't be getting into that today, but it's worth looking at.
So if you wanted to have a few state, you would just make it predictable.
Now I got 2 counts. If I copy all this.
Yeah, I was figuring out the case for it, but when you ask that question.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want a whole bunch of states, especially if you're calling multiple setters that are going to cause re-render, and that's when a different hook would be used called useReducer, where you have to store stuff as an object. You can use an object with this. It works very similarly, just to show that now we have 2 different pieces of state. And it's like you got state 1 and here's your state 2. And this is why primitive types are nice, is because you can still see the data change, where complex types you can't. Yep. Yeah, I could just say, you know, I know that C stands for prev count, so I'm going to say take my C and add or -1 from it. It'll work the same way. Same thing with set state. We say prev state, but you could just say P, and that would be fine. Cool. So use state. It makes state. We're going to use this in the next example as well, so more to come. So example number 2. Component did mount get requests. I'm getting all the characters from Rick and Morty on component did mount. They're coming back as response.data.results. I'm saving them as the characters, and I'm mapping through the characters to make their names show up on the page. We can do all of this with hooks, the lifecycle method and the state. And this is going to be using useEffect and then useState from the previous example. So const app, we erase everything. Let's get rid of this, and I'm going to take this out and just paste it below so we can use it again later. Okay, we need this to work again. So instead of component, we're going to use state, because we want to be able to save our characters still, just like in a class. And then we're going to use another pretty complex hook called useEffect. And the reason why useEffect is complex is it stands for 3 different lifecycle methods. It is component did mount, it is component will unmount, and it is component did update, all in one. So its use depends on how you use it. So the syntax is a little dynamic. useEffect is a function you call, so it doesn't return anything unless you tell it to. So we're just going to useEffect, and what it needs is a callback function, which I'll just throw an anonymous function in there. Now, whatever is on this first line can be either component did mount or component did update. And the thing that determines what this does by default is the second argument you give useEffect. All right, so the first argument is this function. The second argument is an array. And if the array, what they call this array is the dependencies array. It's saying, what is this hook dependent on in order to know whether it should fire again or not? Well, how often does component did mount fire? Once, unless you leave the page and come back. So we're going to tell useEffect that you are not dependent on anything. We're going to give you an empty array, and it knows to only fire when the page loads. So in here, I can take my Axios request, put it back in, and I'm halfway there. Because this is now firing on component did mount. We can see this if I console.log res. What's breaking? Yep. Okay. Let's open the console. There's my response.data.results. I have my Rick and Morty characters from here. Now notice what happens if I don't add this dependency array. I'm going to console log hi and get rid of this. Well, that was anticlimactic. Right. All right, we're almost there. We're almost there. We'll see that in a second. I'm going to leave the array off. What do we need to do when the response comes back? What do we do in a class? Save it in state, but we're not using a class, so we need to declare our own state. What would we start this state off as if it's going to be for an array of characters? Empty array. And it's gonna, we'll call that characters and set characters. So when this comes back, if res.data.results is our characters, how would I make this array the response.data.results? What would I have to write? Set characters. Res.data.results. Okay, and now I can uncomment this and say characters.map. But let me uncomment this console log hi now. What's happening? We are about to get limited by this API is what's about to happen. Because useEffect, I did not put a dependency array in here, so every time the app updates, it's going to fire again. What's causing the app to update inside of this block of code? Yeah, well, that's what's causing it, or that's what's telling useEffect to fire again. But what's re-rendering the app? What's causing the app re-render? Set characters. It's like set state. So once it's done updating a piece of state, it reruns and renders the app to check for data differences. Well, this has been told to run every single time the app reloads. So it goes and gets it, updates the app, goes and gets it, updates the app, goes and gets it, updates the app. The only reason we don't have an infinite loop is because the server takes a half a second to get a response back. So without this in here, we run into real problems. But if I add the array in now to say you are dependent on nothing, fire on load, now we'll just see hi once, and then our data maps out. So this is component did mount.
So when should we have something in the brackets?
Component did update. So if your component after it mounts needs to change when props change, you need to set state because something up above changed. You could say inside of here, hey, if props.name happens to change, run this again. And all you have to do is put the variable in here. It's going to notice when this prop changes that comes down from a parent or context. And if it sees different data, it'll run this again. And now it's component did update. Okay. Let's do one more with useEffect in here for a window key event. So we'll useEffect again. Actually, we can just do it inside of this. Yeah. So we're still inside of component did mount. We want to do our initial get request, but we also want to set a window event listener for a key press. That changes the background color of this div. Right now, it's just going to be the string blue. Okay. So I'd like to be able to hit R, have this turn red, Y, yellow, G, green, you know, all that. So this is still component did mount. We'll set this up. I forget what the whiches are. Let's console log e.which and see which keys are getting pressed and confirm that our key event is working. So I'll hit the letter R, 82, G, 71.
You don't have to use e.key.
The only one, e.key, I don't know if that's case sensitive or not. Maybe that's why. If I hold in shift and press G, no, it's still 71, so it's not case sensitive either. Okay. We'll just use the which for now. I'm going to be that guy. If e.which equals 82, that means they chose the color red, or they hit the letter R. Else if e.which is 71, they chose the color green. I'm going to forget this quickly. All right, we'll finish up this logic in a minute, but mostly to focus on useEffect. This is everything we want to do in the page loads. This is all the setup we want to do. Why would we use component will unmount though? What is component will unmount used for in React? Yeah, cleanup. Well, not necessarily get rid of something that's seen, but something that we don't want to carry over to another page. So when I add a window event to this component, if I don't remove it, it exists on the next page that loads. Same with like an interval. If I set an interval, don't stop it when I leave this page, it's still ticking in the background. So useEffect, if you need to use it for component will unmount, we'll do it down here. You have to return another anonymous function. And useEffect will call this function when this page is about to leave the DOM, or about to leave the view. So whatever we put inside of here is component will unmount. So I will window.remove event listener key down and null. Because this is an anonymous function, I can't give it what to remove. I just say, here's your second argument you're going to yell at me for if I don't give it. It's nothing. And that's component will unmount. Now this event will remove itself when I leave the page. If I want them to be able to hit R and have this change to red, what do I need to introduce to this component? More state. So const color and set color equals useState, and we'll start off as blue. And now we can just say color. Okay. And then if it's red, we'll set color to red. If it's green, we'll set color to green. We got this fancy stuff going on. But you can think about a class component. If you needed all this state and all the setter methods and everything, how much this would take. We're doing it all within these two hooks for state and this one hook for all the setup and cleanup. Cool.
Very cool.
Yeah. All right. That's useEffect. If you had to vote, what is the one piece of React code you've hated the most writing? You're like, this is the part that just confuses me the most. I don't like it, but I have to do it to make context work. The consumer thingy, the higher order component. I don't know, maybe not, maybe hate's a strong word, but I felt that. So there's one more hook we're going to look at called useContext, which makes it so you never have to write a higher order component again if you never want. Hey. So, yeah.
If you're using useEffect, mine just says that it's missing a dependency prop.
Yes.
Where would you need that?
So useEffect, this second argument is the dependency array. If you're referring to anything inside of here that came from outside of this useEffect, so let's say this had a props and we were making a request to props. Oh, let me actually copy this and make it legitimate. Let's do this and go to the index and pass it down as URL equals that. So now I'm passing the URL down as a prop, and I'm making the GET request to props.url. Well, now I'm going to get this. React Hook useEffect has a missing dependency, props.url. Either include it or remove the dependency array. Well, if we remove the dependency array, it's not component did mount. It's going to fire all the time. What it's saying is this effect that you've been using is dependent on something not declared inside of this function, namely this prop. And so because it's doing that, add it to the dependency array. So we'll know whether or not, if that changes, if we need to fire this again. It's almost suggesting it to be component did update, but because we know this prop will never change, it'll still act like component did mount. And it'll just make React happy and get rid of that warning.
So in our useEffect, we are just calling a function that gets data, and then so in the array, I just have that function, and it's still the same thing.
We'll have to look at it. Yeah. It's a little, this is one of the trickier ones to get. I'm going to remove that because the next example doesn't need that prop. We're back. Okay. Example 3, we're back to the count. This time we're going to put this logic in context and then provide it. So here's the app.js, kind of the same one from the first example. What would I be putting in context from this if I wanted to make this a functional component again? What would I have to strip out of app so I could get rid of the component? That? Yeah. So I will still go make a context just the way that we've been doing it. I'll call it the count provider. And I'll bump this back up. But I won't need to bring in component because I've got useState. So const count provider is just a functional component. Okay, I will also create my context per normal. I'll say const count context equals react.create context. And the count provider needs count state and 2 methods. So I'm actually just going to pull that out, put it in, and get rid of all the things we don't need. Actually, never mind. Let's just get rid of it. Sweet. So I'll make my state that this provider is going to provide. I'll say const count and set count equals useState and start at 0. Now, what do our providers return regularly with our class-based providers? What component? There it is. Yes, we still return the provider so that this thing is a provider. And it will still wrap around children, but this is not a class-based component. So how do I refer to children instead of a functional component? Yeah, it's still props.children. It's just not this.props.children. I still give the provider a value, object, and I'll say provide count from this file. But since we have object literals, I can just say provide count, also provide set count. Does object literals make sense, or do we need to see this longhand? This is the same as saying count colon count, set count colon set count. So we are providing this to our app. And I'll export default my count provider. And I'll go and put that in my app.js per normal. And I'll put my count provider around this. All right, so that gets the provider provided, but then we'd go through that little mantra of creating our use count consumer function and all that. No, all we got to do now is say export const count context. And now we have the ability to consume. That's all I have to add is this one word, and I can skip that whole second part. Yeah, where is the consumer coming into play? Why, how is this? Okay, it's not done yet. We have to do one more thing. We have to use context. So we're going to import useContext. And we're going to turn this into a functional component. Okay, so what did I add the export word to in my provider? I'm exporting the count context variable. What does this variable have inside of it? The provider and the consumer. So we're going to export this entire object, and then wherever I need to use it, I will import count context from that file. And then I'll tell my app to use that context. So when I say use context and then I give it a context object, it will return the value from the provider. So this value right here is this object. So it has a value.count and a value.setCount. I like destructuring, so I'm going to say give me count and set count from context. So now I can say count, set count, and set count again. Oh, come on, minus. Line 11 doesn't like me.
Parenthesis on 14 would fix it.
On 14, yeah, I deleted extra brackets. I get so excited at times. Now what am I missing? You can spot it. Oh.
There's missing parentheses.
Too many parentheses. Ours is parenthesis crazy. Okay, and our app's back to working for normal. So what happened here? Well, when we created the provider, we created our context variable per normal. We created our state that we wanted to maintain, and then we provided it via the value prop to any children. We exported the count provider and wrapped it around our index.js like we normally do. But instead of making a higher order function to provide this through the consumer, we just exported our entire count context variable. So that in app, we could say use context and then give it the variable from our provider file. It gives us back the value object, which I destructured. If I called this value, all I'd have to change is every time I use something from that object, I need to say value dot. But that's a little redundant, so destructuring is your friend. Look how small that provider is. So great. Now, what is one thing that you're maybe looking at this context and you're like, wait, how would we do this versus what you usually do with context? Because we haven't covered what we've done in context regularly. We've just done one little simple piece of state. What else do we usually do in context? Get requests. So how would I give this a method? It's not a class. Well, I would just declare a helper function. And then I'd pass that to the value. Now my app.js can receive that and have a button to get data. It's also receiving get data. Now I got your data. Okay. Now, maybe I want it to say, I got your data plus something. It can still receive a parameter, name, I got your data, whoever. And then here, get data, and pass it a parameter. I got your data, stupid. So this could be the ID or something for a handle, delete, whatever. That works the same. You can still pass arguments into the functions. It'll still receive it inside of the provider and do the appropriate action. Where this would be like the Axios request, I would save it in state here, but everything's still being provided the same way. Just looks a little different because we're not in a class. Yeah? Yeah. So play with it. They're easy to break when you're first learning them because it's way more functional component, or it follows way more closely to the functional programming paradigm versus object-oriented, which React kind of looks more like with its classes and state objects. This is way more just functional programming. It's where people that made React want to take the language. So that's why this has become very popular. Yeah.
So basically, it's impossible just to context just for now. Or,
like this, or
yeah,
you can make all your context like this. There's a few different ways to manage it, but this is a pretty simple way. If you want to learn about hooks, this is where I learned about hooks. I went to reactjs.org. I clicked on tutorial. I scrolled down on the right-hand side. No, I didn't. Where is it? Docs. I clicked on docs. At first I clicked this and couldn't find it. Then I went to docs and I saw hooks, new, and introduction to hooks. And there we go. Look at that. That's what we just did. And this guy talks about it.
It's a boring video. I watched it.
It is. Hooks do not replace your knowledge of React concepts. They provide a more direct API for the React concepts you already know. That is why we still teach prop, state, all those things, because it doesn't change that. It furthers it. There are no plans to remove classes. They'll jump directly to the next page if you want to learn. You need some motivation, okay? But what hooks do they have? You can go to Hooks API reference, and these are the ones they've released so far. We did these 3 of the basic hooks, and these are the additionals. I've only used a couple of these, like useReducer is great for object handling. If you ever use Redux, that's what this is. It takes a reducer and gives you back a dispatch method and a state object. Use memo, use callback. Use debug is just for like helpful debugging. But the real power of hooks comes from making your own. So there's another website called usehooks.com. And these are hooks someone has made using React hooks. So use event listener. It doesn't exist in the language, but using these 4 hooks together, they created this little hook that would allow you to use an event listener and set it up easily. Use why did you update? If you need a console log for why something was updated. Like there's all these custom hooks. So you know how we covered render props and we made that form component? You can do the same thing with hook. You just call it use form, and it would give you all the functionality needed to be a form, but it wouldn't be a component. It'd be a hook. One last thing. The downside to hooks right now is it's harder to see their state in React, but the upside is there's no additional wrappers. We don't see any sort of consumer wrapper here, right? Because we're not wrapping it in a component, we're using a function. So everywhere you use a component like render props, hider components, you get another wrapper for every single one, and your dev tool comes very complex. Hooks don't create a wrapper in DevTools. It'll be like it's invisible. You'll just see the functionality over in this column. So there's a bunch of advantages to it in that way. Yeah. And this guy says they're easy to understand, so take it up with him. There's actually one in here that I really liked called use local storage, and it treats local storage like a database, and it sets it all up for you. You just have to give it something to set or get, and it does all the work. So if you don't want to learn local storage, you can just use his code, and then if you ever have asked a question about it, you can just run. No, you should probably learn about it. Okay, I set up that whole event listener. I could also just say use key press and tell it which keys to listen for. Like use key press, H. If that happens, if happy press is pressed, then show a smile emoji. So really quick way to set up a key press event listener. So custom hooks are super powerful. It's really easy to make your own.
But where does he define use key press?
Right here. So it takes a target key, it sets up state for you. It sets up a couple handler methods for key down, key up, and then just uses useEffect for the setup and cleanup.
You can use that for scroll.
Yeah, they've got a bunch on here. Oh, okay, 2 pages.
Oh, demounts would be cool.
Yes. Use click on outside. Use animation. Right, so React didn't make any of these. These are just made, oh, there's the use local storage. Yeah. Yeah, it works just like useState. You give it a key and value pair to start your state off as, and it gives you back the name or the piece of local storage and the way to update local storage. Yeah, it's wonderful. So those are hooks. They were added to the language a year ago, and that's why it's like once you learn something, there's always more. Even with the stuff you've learned, they'll keep adding to it. So feel free to use these. I'll be happy to help you debug them because you'll get lots of bugs the first time, typically. But once you use them right, then they lighten your load quite a bit. So I'll pass these out as notes. If you want to see an example, comment out one, comment in another, or maybe the second one. And then you can play with the other example that we had. And then in the folder, I have an examples folder with the useState, the useEffect, useContext. But if you're looking at example 2, please don't everyone at once. I don't want the Rick and Morty API to limit us. And if everyone does this request over and over again from the same IP address, we will get limited.